Welcome, Candice, to Better Tech. And before diving in, let's have a brief introduction about yourself and your role for our audience.
Well, thank you for welcoming me and having me. I am General Counsel at Sezzle. I am on a campaign committee for Simpson Housing Services. It's a local homeless shelter here in Minneapolis. And I'm an advisor for Blacks United and Leading Technology International. I've been in-house in compliance for approximately 20 years at public and private companies. I'm a decorated war veteran. I was in Desert Shield and Desert Storm as a mechanic.
Okay, cool. So the topic that we have for today is driving team performance with diversity and inclusion. So before we get into the topic, like the nitty-gritty of it, what is diversity and inclusion for you? Because I feel that's something quite subjective. So how would you define it, and specifically at your organization?
Perfect. Okay. Diversity is the presence of a variety of differing attributes, and inclusion is embracing those differences. Because it's important to note that diversity is a noun and inclusion is a verb, and inclusion is the action required to achieve a state of true diversity. Diversity and inclusion, they're more than just giving the underrepresented a voice, because the minorities have voices. It's giving them an ear and lending a hand. So it's the act of listening to differing voices and factoring those differences into decisive action.
Right. And how do the many facets of a diverse workforce beyond the C-suite come together to drive this productivity?
So a workforce that replicates social demographics allows for a go-to market strategy that reaches a broader market. When you have a diverse workforce, you actually create a mini ecosystem of your larger market. By creating this corporate cultural ecosystem, you get two solid outcomes. One, you get ahead of the problems that you might face in the larger market because you're listening to your team. And two, you can build products that actually satisfy the desires of a wider demographic market. So to point one, if or when an employee were to voice a concern, it's quite likely that a customer or an investor would share the same sentiment. So when you ignore your internal voice or your internal warnings, you can actually suffer backlash. And a homogenous leadership team, they tend to see a picture from the same perspective, but diverse teams can see things from a different angle and call out blind spots. And in fact, most whistleblower cases are people who tried to warn a company, but whose warnings were ignored. And those problems have cost companies billions. And to the second point, a workforce that replicates diversity of the market is far more likely to create a solution that thrives in the market than a homogenous group who feels that they believe they know what's best. And a great example of this would be the auto industry decline in the 1980s. Executives were sure they knew that Americans needed bigger, robust cars, even though they were costly to manufacture, despite alleged feedback from employees and customer surveys, which stated that consumers were looking for more affordable forms of transportation. The signs were there, and while there may have been some minute diversity, there was no inclusion, and the result was that the lower-priced Japanese cars sort of just consumed the market share. But it does make sense, if you think about like your car, you have like a lot of warning lights on your car, and you wouldn't only want one warning light or a bunch of seatbelt lights. That only gives you limited exposure to the overall state of the car. You want to know if the engine's out of whack, if the airbag's defective, the oil pressure's higher, if you left your car door open. So you would never want unity or just a single perspective, and even the smaller things in your life, you wouldn't want it in an organization. Diversity matters.
So then, do you feel that there's a strong correlation between having a diverse workforce and financial performance of an organization?
Absolutely. The Boston Consultant Group conducted a study in 2017, and they said that businesses that had more or above average diversity on their management team had 19% higher revenues from their innovative products than those with less diverse leadership. And according to a study by Josh Bersin, which they're a corporate talent and HR agency, companies with diversity and inclusion had 2.3 times higher cash flow per employee over a 3-year period. They had smaller companies had like 13 times higher mean cash flows from their operations, 1.5 to 1.7 times more likely to be innovators in their market. Diversity and inclusion impacts the bottom line, but it has to start at the top. And even if you wanted to discount the financial impact attributed to the diversity through these statistical studies, you can't dismiss the harm that failing to have it can cause. I think Uber paid over $4 million to compensate its employees for gender discriminations, not to include the lost market share they suffered to its leading competitor resulting from all their negative press. So when you have a homogenous leadership team, you have employees and customers who don't align necessarily with a particular cookie cutter perspective. So you stunt potential growth across the company and the community. Baskin Robbins, they're famous for having 31 flavors, and that 31 flavors is sort of their trademark. They have a diverse offering. Now, a leadership team of 31 would be a lot, but you do need more than one flavor. Vanilla appeals to some, chocolate appeals to some, but some of the greatest minds out there are hungry for butterscotch, ripple, and mint chocolate chip.
That's a great analogy, I feel, comparing the concept of diversity and inclusion with ice cream flavors. So, and when you mentioned that it starts at the top, do you mean like it starts with the leadership?
Correct. Yeah, the leadership team, when the leadership team is diverse and willing to listen, you set the tone throughout the organization. Leadership, it's critical that it is at the top. And the good part is when the leadership has this, when the leadership is diverse, you don't have to create or contrive acceptance. It's already there. The employees know that they have a relatable resource, and customers and partners and investors, they all know that.
So what are some of the I'd say like common pickup points that, as a leader that pick up on this, oh, this is working well, this strategy is working well, this is something that we need to improve on? What are like the common signals as a leader, and you're in a leadership position as well? So how do you measure that then?
So measuring diversity can be complicated because in some jurisdictions, it's illegal to capture sensitive information unless an individual consents to it. So you do have to encourage people of diverse backgrounds to voluntarily provide that information. So if you are of a diverse background, and that could be anything, whether it's race or gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation or preferences, or even just culture. I mean, whatever your diversity is, if you own it and represent and be out there and be forthcoming about it, it helps companies make sure that they are respecting and develop and envelop these differences. But either way, whether you voluntarily disclose it or not, it doesn't relieve the company of the obligations from an ethics perspective to make sure that that information isn't used to discriminate against people for those diversities. So there does need to be robust policies there. But when you're looking to measure, some of the best things leaders can do is you measure your demographics of your applicants from the applicant selection, the promotion, and the development. When you're looking at how diverse your applicants are, if they're not diverse, and if you do not see that you're getting a wide variety of diversity in your recruitment efforts, then you can reasonably predict that the resulting metrics will be low. So if you hire a high level of minorities, but you don't promote them, or you interview but you don't hire them, looking at it across the spectrum can let you see where your breakdowns are occurring, and it allows you to investigate. Some companies do look at their diversity and compare it to the city or the state. You need to be cautious about doing that because a lot of times companies operate in a homogeneous neighborhood. So if you compare your demographics with your neighborhood's demographics, it's not reflective necessarily of the community or society as a whole. So it is better to look at a larger perspective when trying to obtain your metrics. But I would say measure throughout the continuum, from the time that you're recruiting to the time that you're promoting, and then look at where those numbers are falling, why they're not going up or why they're not high, and investigate that for sure.
And so do you think like these are some of the common metrics, right, to take into account, like gender, ethnicity, encouraging debates, conflicts? So do you think it's relatively easier for large organizations to have a more diverse and inclusive team as compared to like an SMB or a startup, for instance? Is this something that is like, I would say it's more easier for the leadership of a large company to implement than it is for somebody who's just like starting out with a small scale business?
It can be hard for smaller scales, especially when you're looking at something like in the STEM technology, where there tends to be less diversity that are going in. You can always get to the diversity you need by making sure that you are deliberately taking action to do so. And that goes back to the inclusive part. It's not just setting some lofty goals out there. It is actually doing the work to get to those goals.
Okay. And then many organizations also avoid culture change, for instance, due to the fear of it backfiring, impact on the brand, or they don't have a clear direction. So how should like one go about it then?
Well, yeah, there will be downsides. Conflict is number one. There's always conflict. The more diverse the viewpoints, the more likely that you're going to have some conflict. But that's the best part about it. First of all, if your decisions as a leader cannot withstand scrutiny, then it's the leader who needs to be called into question, because a decision that can't be tested shouldn't be tried. So you got to embrace the conflict. And this doesn't mean to start fights, but to see a contrary opinion as that warning light on the dashboard. If you were driving and a warning light came off, you don't unplug the warning light. You don't cut the wiring. You try to figure out what's causing that. Is there something I missed? Is there a bigger systemic problem here that I need to look at? So it's a great opportunity to make sure that how you're moving forward is holistically sound.
So speaking of like, if you look at the entire business scenario, do you feel that there was like one particular moment that really sparked this diversity and inclusiveness in companies? Because this is something that we didn't really see like some years back, right? So a lot of companies are now picking up into it. And if, for instance, like you mentioned, the companies are going over, like they're facing lawsuits over stuff like this. So what do you think like really set the momentum for this?
Well, I think a big part of it would be the paradigm shift in how we work. I mean, about 20 years ago, there was a work time period and there was a personal time period. And the two never really joined. There was a wall between what you did at work, what you did in your work environment. But as technology advances, those walls are eroding, and the remote structure is generating more of a commingling of professional and personal lives in an unprecedented manner. And it's not uncommon to be on a video call and you could see children or pets running around in the background, or people are taking their calls on the way to the dentist or the cabin or on the beach or grocery shopping. So right now, our jobs and our personal lives have so intertwined, and they're just invading one another, that what we could keep separate previously, 20 years ago, whatever your particular preferences and decisions were, stayed at home, and you let them go when you went into the work. Now they are so joined together that we need to respect the differences even more, because they're in the forefront of every day and of our jobs. So it's imperative that we embrace the variety.
Okay. And so have you ever experienced, like with the clients that you worked with, you feel that they're not really picking up on this as fast enough as they should? What advice would you give them? Have you ever come across such a case?
Yes. There's a few, and I've actually seen two scenarios where you can have sort of this two sides of the same coin where something is falling down. One side of it was, for instance, I was at a company, and I noticed that a particular woman kept bringing up concerns, and the management team was, well, her concerns are, she's just a woman, she's just venting. And she really wanted to help the company and wanted things to get better. So she found a willing ear of somebody at the company who was lower than her, but compelling. So she told her concerns, what remediations were necessary, and he ended up going to the leadership team, and the leadership team said, oh my goodness, we need to fix this. And they immediately took action. So that's a great example of where you have diversity and not inclusion. Her voice wasn't heard, and it was clear from the leadership that it was because she was a woman, but she found a way around that. Once the man was praised for his efforts, he humbly and kindly handed the recognition properly where it belonged. That was a bad example of how a company should handle things, but it was a real one. But there was a reverse scenario as well, where I worked with one woman who was wicked smart. She knew the product, she knew the market, but she came from a culture where women were a little more submissive and restrained. But she would bring up some amazing ideas, and the minute she got pushback, she shut down. She saw resistance, that it was a cue that she just needed to be quiet, as opposed to an invitation to accept. So in one scenario, they were pushing the woman down, and the other one, they were really trying to engage, but they lacked the communication skills respective to her culture to properly engage her and to continue to involve her. So they wanted it, but they lacked the skills. And those are two good examples of where the breakdowns can occur on either side, whether the employee or the company.
Right. So you mentioned, you touched upon this earlier when it comes to like recruitment, right? The talent that the company is getting needs to be more diverse. So So there is a stereotype, right? Even today, that younger people, millennials, and those people are kind of like going for companies that are very modern or that are very like their digital game is like really strong, and then the older employees are kind of they're like okay with how things are, they're resistant to change. So I'm curious to know, how does this kind of impact the workforce in the organization then, if the demographics are kind of different? Because I
That's a
don't
great
really
point.
see that an organization could be really diverse and inclusive if the age demographics are like really different.
And that's a good point. So two things on that. So in 2000, 35% of the workforce was 45 or over. In 2010, 42% of the workforce was 45% or was 45 or older. And those percentages continue to grow. So you do have this older workforce constantly standing there when you have a younger workforce who has an entirely different perception of how things should be managed. So there is some diversity on that front as well. And just as we need to respect the diversity for genders and races, that age is not without merit. Those walls are eroding. And I think even the older employees are coming to the conclusion that it matters, it impacts the bottom line, they have to take action. So for no other reason, you get the people who you hope are doing the right thing for the right thing's sake. And then there are the times where you just hope they're doing the right thing because that's economically a bad idea not to. But technology is advancing enough, and it all comes down on this point to education, making sure that the older generation who is used to keeping things separated, keeping the personal lives out, is now educated on why this change is necessary and why the embracing of technology is important. But it's also important to educate the younger workforce that they do have to work with somebody who's less educated on the technology or less exposed, and to help teach them as well, teach them how to communicate.
So this education that you're talking about, I assume it's something that should be ingrained in the company culture. Like it's the leadership's responsibility to kind of have it through every aspect of the organization, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, I would argue that inclusion in your policies, your procedures, and your go to your employee strategy is as important, if not more important, than diversity, because you can hire diverse people, but if you aren't giving them the chance to participate and you're not including them, then it's really just a facade. You have to allow anybody of diverse background to be able to speak and to contribute meaningfully. You need to empower them to make their decisions. You need to encourage them to speak up. You need to give them opportunity. These are all critical for them.
So Candice, again, this is something that I know it's fairly recent with the recent move to work from home model. How is that something that has impacted this diversity and inclusiveness? Because I feel that was something that was, it was far more easier to have these meetings or this culture while you were at an office, a physical office space. How do you kind of go about it if you're working remotely? And especially if like you're a global business. So how does that play out?
So I do believe that the remote workforce is actually encouraging the acceptance and inclusion, because you do get to see people. So a lot of times you can make presumptions about whether or not people are diverse or not. I actually have a funny anecdotal story on that. My grandmother is actually Native American, and she married a Caucasian, and in order to inundate herself more with his life, she decided to take a white name, and the name she chose was Eddie Ben. She liked the way it sounded. She liked the way it rolled off the tongue, and she ended up actually getting drafted for World War II when she was 9 months pregnant. The significance of that is what she heard and what people heard, what she believed and other people believed. There's clearly a cultural communication breakdown here. But now when you're on video with people, you're seeing people in their living rooms and in their backyards, and you're seeing them around their kids. You're seeing them with their partners. So this is actually, the remote workforce is really bringing to light just how diverse we can be, because sometimes you look at someone and you may presume you know what diversity they offer, but until they've actually disclosed, it's really speculation on your part. So I would caution people against trying to guess the diversity of their workforce. and don't try to use your, sort of this thumb in the air guess and say, oh, I'm pretty sure we have this many Blacks, this many Latinos. People need to let you know what they are before you try taking a swing at it. And then recognizing that this remote scenario is making those things a lot more obvious than they were in the past.
So is there one area that you feel there is still a lot of room for improvement? That this is something that organizations in general are missing the mark on?
Inclusion. I would definitely say inclusion. When you look at policies, a lot of times you'll see goals to get certain demographics of underrepresented employees, and you see these goals, and even if you target them, but you don't hire them, or you hire them, but you don't promote them, or they're not leadership, it's important that inclusion is truly embraced. I mean, you cannot have diversity without inclusion. And a lot of the policies and procedures and goals, they really tend to discount that latter point. And I would say inclusion comes with it, not only promoting it and actually requiring it in some form or fashion, but also education. We go back to that again. Sometimes people just don't know how to communicate with people of varying demographics. And to that point, it is just incumbent upon a company to engage that conversation. And even if you have somebody who might be less willing to communicate, they need to get them involved, because you need everybody's opinion, and getting those opinions to the table is sometimes hard. So education would be the best way to promote the inclusion part of it, which I think is somewhat lacking still.
Right. And how far do you think there should be a distinction when it comes to implementing or these policies between the senior management and then the HR department? Because I mean, it's something that you typically in the books, right? This is something that falls under the umbrella of the HR department. But I understand that obviously as a leader, as a person in any senior position, you have to kind of be in that position to kind of influence people and lead them on in a good way. But do you think there should be a distinction? And if so, how much?
Leadership is primary on this one for sure, because even if HR can bring in diverse people, if leadership is not giving those people a voice or making sure that they're in positions of authority or able to make decisions, then you're not really accomplishing much. You're not really advancing the cause of any minority at that point. You're just you're making yourself look good for the wrong reason. So it has to be a leadership-driven initiative. It has to be from the top down. We want to be inclusive, and this is how we want to be inclusive. Now, it cannot be done without HR or people ops involvement. They certainly need to be the ones that are recruiting through the proper channels, and marketing and advertising and promoting what is being done within the company. So that clearly falls within human resources. But if you don't have the leadership, then it's just going to fail.
Mm-hmm. And so this may be a difficult question, but if you had to pick 3 qualities that make a good leader, what would those 3 qualities be?
Open mind, active ears, and working hands. So open mind, that they're willing to let other ideas and other thoughts and other people come forward. Active ears, they have to be willing to listen. And then working hands, they need to be taking that advice and using it for decisive action. It cannot just be, it's just not idle. Diversity and inclusion does not happen idly. It has to have action behind it.
Okay. And just as an ending note, is there anything that you'd like to share with people entrepreneurs or founders of startups getting into this space? Because like you mentioned, it can be a bit hard for them. So is there anything that you'd like to share?
Sure. I would say that just to remember that diversity is a noun. It's a desired state. There has to be inclusion of diverse employees before it benefits the company and benefits the community as a whole. That would be sort of the summary.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Candice. That was a really good talk. I mean, you had plenty of great insights to share around this topic. So thank you once again for being on BetterTech.
Thank you. Thank you.